All right, section 6.3 is on solving quadratic equations by factoring. So I kind of previewed this a little bit for you last time so you could start on your homework. But basically, you can find the zeros of a quadratic equation by factoring. So remember, zeros are also called x-intercepts, roots. Anytime you hear any of those words, it means find where you're crossing the x-axis. If you want to find the zeros of a function, set it equal to 0 and find the solutions of the equation. So most of the time, this will involve factoring. Okay, so it says if the product of two quantities equals 0. So if I had x times y equals 0, if x was equal to 0, that would be true. If y was equal to 0, that would be true. So that means either x is equal to 0 or y is equal to 0. All right, so if I have something that's factored, so if I had 3x minus 1 times 2x plus 5 equals 0, this is the same kind of setup. You have something times something else equals 0. Okay, so either the first something's equal to 0 or the second one's equal to 0. So when I solve, I'd get 3x equals 1, so x equals 1/3. This is 2x equals -5, so x equals -5/2. Okay, so both of those numbers, if you plug them back in the original, you get 0 out. So they both work. Okay, so the first example said find the zeros of each function by factoring. So that's what I said I kind of previewed for you last time. So when it said find the zeros, we let our function equal 0. We factored, set each piece equal to 0, and we solved. Okay, so what this means for our parabola, we know our parabola is going up, right, because it's positive x squared. So it's going to go through those two zeros. So it's going to look something like that. Okay, so that's what it means about our parabola. So those are the locations where it crosses the x-axis. All right, so it says in physics, you're often going to talk about projectiles. So the general function that approximates the height in feet of a projectile is given by h of t equals -16t squared plus v sub o. Anybody have any ideas what v sub o is? And what do you think the sub o means? It means initial. So v sub o is the initial velocity. So it's v sub o t plus h sub o. So if v sub o was initial velocity, what do you think h sub o is? Initial height, right? Okay, there's no reason that you would need to memorize this formula. I'll usually just give you the equation. Okay, but projectiles are very, very important. So if someone like fires a gun into the air, you know, like a lot of people like give a warning shot and like fire the gun in the air, that travels in a parabola shape and lands somewhere. And that initial velocity, if there wasn't any air resistance, it would be the exact same velocity coming down. So it does slow down a little bit because of the air, but it's still going really fast when it hits the ground. Okay, so projectiles are really important. There's also, like, if you're bombing someone, I mean, that's a projectile motion. This is morbid, but it's true. Golf balls, hitting a golf ball, projectile motion.
Bombs, golf balls.
I'm trying to think of something less morbid. Can you think of anything else that would be projectile motion? So something that makes a arc like this. Basically anything that you hit into the air and comes back down would be projectile motion. Kendall's going to toss Gabby in the air. Okay, so Mackenzie hit a golf ball on the ground with her driver. So use the general function for a projectile to write a function that shows the height in feet of her golf ball as a function of time. So this ball was hit with an initial velocity of 100 feet per second. So our equation, so this is our v sub o. What's h sub o? Initial height. And what's h sub o in this problem? 0, because she's hitting it from the ground. Should have made this problem Caitlin. Caitlin McKenzie. Okay, so let's figure out our equation. So I have h sub t equals -16t squared plus v sub ot, so 100t, plus 0. So you don't have to write the plus 0, but it'd be on the end, plus 0. Okay, so the question is, how long will her golf ball stay in the air? So in other words, we want to know when it hits the ground. So we know it starts on the ground. When's it going to hit the ground again? Okay, so I say 0 equals negative 16t squared plus 100t. Okay, this is an equation that has t squared and t in it, so we're going to have to factor. So you can pull out what they have in common, since there's not just a number on the end or anything. So what do they have in common? I know I have a t. Yeah, let's do 4. So 4t. So I'd have negative 4t plus 25. Okay, so that means one of those two pieces is going to be our solution. So I'm going to have either 4t equals 0, or I'm going to have negative 4t plus 25 equals 0. Let me solve. So I'm going to subtract my 25 over. So I get negative 25 divided by 4, which is 6.25. Now on the other one, if I divide by 4, I just get t equals 0. So t equals 0 is saying at time 0. That makes sense because the ball is on the ground at time 0. She's going to hit it. It goes up in the air, and it stays in the air for 6.25 seconds. So this is when it hits the ground again. Make sense? Okay, so it says, recall from algebra there are several special products and factors. So we've talked about the difference of two squares before. So the difference of two squares is x squared minus y squared equals x plus y times x minus y. And then there's perfect square trinomials. So if I have x squared plus 2xy plus y squared, I don't usually memorize these ones. You know, I don't usually have you memorize them. But you can think about how they factor. You need x in the first spot, x in the last spot. You need your last terms to multiply to be y squared, so y and y. And your outer and inner need to combine to be 2xy. So if they were both positive, that happens. So plus plus. So that's why it's called a perfect square trinomial, because it's x plus y quantity squared. So with a square on the outside. It's the same thing with if I had a minus in between. So x squared minus 2xy plus y squared. You can factor, it'd be x minus y times x minus y, which is x minus y squared. Okay, so find the roots of each equation by factoring. Okay, so root means solution. So I'm going to do 4b squared equals 1, so I'm going to have 4b squared minus 1 equals 0. I'm going to solve. Oh, I guess I can solve this two different ways, can't I? So if I see that, I see I have the difference two squares. So I'm going to do 2b plus 1 times 2b minus 1 equals 0. And I'm going to set each piece equal to 0. So I have 2b plus 1 equals 0, 2b minus 1 equals 0. So I get 2b equals negative 1. So b equals negative 1/2. That's the first one. And the other one I solve, when I add 1 to the other side, I get 2b equals 1. So I get b equals 1/2. So I get negative 1/2 and 1/2. Now in this first example, there was actually another way to solve, since it just had b squared and it didn't have b. So I'm going to write second way. You could have started with 4b squared equals 1, and you could have divided by 4 on both sides. So you get 1/4. How do I get rid of my b squared? How do I solve for b? Square root, right? And whenever you take the square root, you write plus or minus. So you get b equals plus or minus square root of the top and square root of the bottom. So square root of 1 over the square root of 4 is 1 over 2. Okay? So that's another way you could have gotten the same answer. All right, number 2, so I have 36x squared minus 25 equals 0. So go ahead and try to solve that with factoring. And same thing with number 3. So on number 3, you're going to want to add the 4 over first and try to factor. So go ahead and try to factor these. I'll go around and check. All right, so I walked around and you guys all had the first one at least, so let's look at that. So you had 6x plus 5 times 6x minus 5, because it was the difference of two squares, right? 36x squared was 6x times 6x, and negative 25 was 5 times 5, and it was the difference. There was a minus between them. Okay, so you set each piece equal to 0 and solve. So you get 6x equals negative 5, 6x equals 5. So x equals negative 5/6 and x equals 5/6 are your answers. All right, and then the next one, when you factor, you need y and y. They need to multiply to be plus 4, and then the outer and inner need to combine to be negative 4y. So I need, let's try 2 and 2. My outer and inner, they would make negative 4y if both were negative. And we knew they had to be the same sign since they multiply to be positive 4. Okay, equals 0. So that means I get y minus 2 equals 0, and you'd also have y minus 2 equals 0 again. So you only have to write it once. So you get y equals 2. Okay, so let's kind of go the opposite way. So we're going to write a quadratic function in standard form with zeros of 3 and negative 2. Okay, so think about that. So how did we get a 0 of 2 in this last example? Do you guys see how you had y minus 2 as a factor? Basically, if you plug that 0 in, you get 0. Okay, so if I'm going to have 3 and negative 2 as zeros, that means for my function, I need to have certain factors. So if I want a 0 of 3, what factor do I need? Kendall, what you know? I need x minus 3. See how if you have a 0 of 3, three would make that 0. Okay, so how about negative 2? What would I need as a factor? Yeah, I need x plus 2. Okay, so it's always in the form x minus the number. So x minus the 0. So if we had x minus a negative 2, that's why it's x plus 2. Okay. So when I multiply out my function, so we're going to FOIL. Well, let me write this. So negative 2 makes 0. All right, so when I multiply it out, I'm going to FOIL. X times x is x squared. My outer is plus 2x. My inner is minus 3x. And my last is minus 6. So my function is x squared minus x minus 6. Okay, that is a function that has 3 and negative 2 as zeros. So if you plug in 3 or negative 2 into that function, you should get 0 out. Okay, but it's not the only function. So think about other functions that would have those as zeros. I mean, you could have another actual, like, parenthesis. You could have, like, x minus 5. That would have another 0 of 5. So those aren't the only ones that have zeros of 3 and negative 2. Now, you could also have, and we'll get to this later, but what if I had like a 6 out front? Does that still have zeros of 3 and negative 2? Yeah, it still has zeros of 3 and negative 2, right? It just has a number in front of your x squared. So another function would be like, you don't have to write this, but 6x squared minus 6x minus 36. So multiplying any number in to all of them. That would be another function that has those zeros. Okay, so usually like on your homework or tests, I would say write the simplest function. So that way you guys know you don't have to put a number out front. Okay. And I realized on your homework I actually forgot to put these problems. So that doesn't mean they won't be on your test. You might want to write yourself a note in your notes and say, wasn't on homework but will be on the test. So you remember to study them. Okay, so number 5. So write a quadratic function with zeros, negative 4 and 1/2. Okay, so that means our function, if I want negative 4, I'm going to have x plus 4. If I want 1/2, I'm going to have x minus a 1/2. Okay, you can multiply that out, but you're going to have fractions. So some of you guys like to avoid fractions. So remember I said you can put any number here? What's the smallest one that would be really convenient for us? 2. So if I put a 2 there, that means I'm really going to have x plus 4 times 2x minus 1. So I multiplied it into the second part here. Good question. Why does it not multiply into the first spot? So think of actual numbers. If I had 2 times 3 times 4, what is 2 times 3 times 4? 24. So could you have, if I did 2 times 3 and then 2 times 4 and then multiplied them together, 2 times 3 would be 6, 2 times 4 would be 8, you'd get 48. You've now multiplied by an additional 2. Okay, so when you're multiplying these numbers, what you do in your head is you probably multiplied and got 6, and then you multiplied by 4. So you can multiply numbers in any order. That's called the commutative property, so you can move them around. So what I did up here is I just moved them around. I said, okay, well basically I have x plus 4 times 2 times x minus 1/2, and I chose to multiply these ones together. Okay, so I'm just moving things around. Okay, so my function, when I FOIL, I get x times 2x is 2x squared. My outer is negative 1x. My inner is plus 8x. My last is negative 4. So f of x equals 2x squared plus 7x minus 4. All right, tricky one. So write a quadratic function with zeros of negative 3 over 2 and 7 over 3. So I'm going to have f of x equals x minus 3 over 2. I'm going to leave a little space. Oh, plus, thank you. And then I'm going to have x minus 7 over 3. So what do I want to multiply by the first parenthesis to make this a nicer function? 2. What do I want to multiply by the second parenthesis to make it a nicer function? 3. And it just said write any quadratic function with these zeros, so that's what we're doing. Okay, so that means I'd really have 2x plus 3 times 3x minus 7. And then I'm ready to FOIL, so 6x squared. My outer is negative 14x. My inner is plus 9x. My last is negative 21. So my function is 6x squared minus 5x minus 21. Okay, and the next one, what is the positive solution of the equation? So I have 2a squared minus 8a minus 42 equals 0. Okay, so do you guys notice this one has a GCF of 2? So to make it easier when I'm factoring, I'm going to pull that out to the front. So they all had a factor of 2, so I can pull it to the front. So I have 2 times a squared minus 4a minus 21. Okay, much easier to factor because 21 only has 2 pairs of factors, 1 and 21, 7 and 3. I always tell you to pick the numbers that are closest together, so I'd probably try the 7 and 3. I know I need a and a. I need 7 and 3. They need to be opposite signs to multiply to be negative 21. So when you look at your outer and inner, you would need a negative 7a and a plus 3a in order to get the negative 4a. Okay, so this is set equal to 0. Okay, so I can definitely see this being like a multiple choice question on the SATs or something. And for your choices, they'd probably have 3, 7, negative 7, negative 3, and 2. I can see them having those. Do you see why I would have all those different things for choices? Okay, so what is the positive solution? 7. So you guys wouldn't be fooled by that at all. So you see that you have a minus 7 equals 0 and a plus 3 equals 0. So a equals 7 and a equals negative 3. This is the only positive solution. Okay, a lot of people ask about that 2 out front. What that's saying is 2 times a number times another number equals 0. So you guys could write 2 equals 0, but that's not possible, right? So that's not giving you any solution. So it's only 7.